What's up guys, Nuance Bro checking in, and today we're going to be talking about the LGBTQ Town Hall by CNN that was held yesterday, and specifically about the trans issues related to that. But before we start, videos like this tend to get demonetized, so if you'd like to support this channel and see more content like this going forward, please go to nuancebro.com/join. So yesterday, CNN had their LGBTQ Town Hall, and this was for the Democratic presidential candidates, and they spoke on the issues of the LGBTQ community. Now, various issues were discussed, and I will admit I did not watch the whole thing, but I did see certain clips that did pique my interest, so we're going to talk about those today. And in particular, it has to do with the trans issues. So let's take a look at this clip.
As I know you are aware,
People are dying! Do not say! People are dying! Don't say!
It's okay. It's okay. Be cool. It's okay. It's okay. Hey, guys. Whoa. Yo, guys, chill out. Guys, relax. Let me just point out, there is a long and proud tradition in history in the gay, lesbian, and transgender community of protest, and we applaud them for their protest. And they are absolutely right to be angry and upset at the lack of attention, particularly in the media, on the lives of transgendered. I agree with you, ma'am. I'm not applauding. Yeah.
So right off the bat, we have Pete Buttigieg and Anderson Cooper and a questioner, and the questioner was interrupted by protests from members of the audience. And you can see the members of the audience were saying that trans lives matter, trans people are dying, do something. And you could actually see Anderson Cooper here saying that we should applaud, or we applaud these people. And then some woman in the audience said something, and then he said, "Oh, I agree with you, I'm not applauding," which is weird because he just said we applaud them. I don't know, that was weird. But the issue that I wanted to focus on is this idea that trans people are dying. So I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but there's this big issue in the trans community or the LGBT community at large about transgenders being murdered. So when they talk about trans people are dying, do something, they are saying that trans people are being murdered in the streets and that this is a huge problem and that politicians need to do something and take action. Now, this issue always perplexed me because I always heard people talking about transgender murders and things like that, but I never heard anybody ever use the stats. So what are the stats behind transgender murders? Now, a great resource that I found is from the leftist publication Mike, and this is their page, Unerased, Counting Transgender Lives. A comprehensive look at transgender murders since 2010. The number is rising and likely far higher than we know. And if we scroll down, we can see number of documented transgender homicides per year. So how many is it? Well, we can see in the year 2010, there was a total of 9 homicides. Now, I don't know about you, but 9 homicides in a year in a country of 330 million people, I don't know if I would consider that an epidemic. But the argument being made is that it's rising. And as you can see here, it is rising. So we go from 9 homicides in 2010, and we can see a peak here of 24 homicides in 2015, and the most recent number that they have is in 2016 of 23 homicides. So for the purposes of this video, let's deal with the most recent number that we have in this graph, which is 2016, 23 homicides. Now, to be fair, 23 homicides might seem low, but we have to look at things per capita. That means if there's a already small portion of transgender people, and there's a number that seems small for homicides, it actually might be a very large number when we look at it on a per capita basis. So what are those numbers? Well, first we have to figure out how many trans people are in the United States. Well, the best estimate we seem to have comes from a 2016 survey from the Williams Institute that estimated that 0.6% of US adults identify as transgender. And when we look at the US population, it's at about 330 million. Also, keep in mind that 0.6% is for US adults. It's not all people in the United States. So the percentage might actually be even higher, but we're just going to work with the 0.6% percentage here. So let's do the math. So if we do 330 million times 0.006 to get 0.6%, we get about 2 million. So going back to that 23 homicides, if we take 23 divided by 2 million and then multiply by 100,000 to get per capita, we get a rate of 1.15 per 100,000 as a homicide rate. So 1.15 per 100,000. Now, is that a high homicide rate? Well, let's look at the general US population. So if we look at the homicide rate in the US, we can see that it usually is around 5 per 100,000 or 5.3. So that means that the homicide rate in the United States per capita for the general population is 4.5 times higher than it is for transgender people. So it seems kind of weird to focus on transgender murders in particular when their homicide rate is actually way less than the general population in the United States. Now, if you're one of the people who's familiar with this issue, you might be asking, but Nuance bro, what about Black trans women? What about that issue? That's where the homicide rates are just off the charts, aren't they? Well, I'm glad you brought that up because in this CNN town hall on LGBTQ issues, someone actually brought that issue up.
Earlier and that have spoken up today, especially Black trans women.
I don't want to take this away from you, but let me tell you something. Black trans women are being killed in this country, and CNN, you have erased Black trans women for the last time. Let me tell you something. Black trans women are dying. Our lives matter. I am an extraordinary Black trans woman, and I deserve to be here. My Black trans sisters that are here, I am tired. I am so tired. I'm just sitting there, and it's not just my Black trans women, it's my Black trans brothers too. And I'm going to say what I'm going to say.
So in this video, you can see a Black trans woman who comes up and says Black trans women are dying, and CNN is ignoring it and all these things. And this is something I've seen brought up multiple times. I saw it by Cory Booker, I believe, in the first Democratic debate.
We do not talk enough about trans Americans, especially African American trans Americans, and the incredibly high rates of murder right now.
And then now people like Beto O'Rourke talking about it, this person bringing it up, and other people bring it up all the time. So what are the true numbers around this? Well, if we go back to that resource I mentioned earlier from Mike, we can see a stat here that says 72% of trans homicide victims were Black trans women and femmes 2010 to 2016. Now, 72% of all the trans homicides being Black trans women seems actually very high and disproportionate. So what does that mean statistically? Well, in order to figure that out, first we have to figure out what portion of the overall transgender community are Black trans people. Now, the way we can figure that out is by looking at this study from the Williams Institute from UCLA School of Law, Race and Ethnicity of Adults Who Identify as Transgender in the United States. And this was published October 2016. And if we scroll down, we can see this graph here. So in light blue, you can see the numbers that represent the adult general population. And in the dark blue, we can see the transgender identified adults. Now you can see in that first row, it says white non-Hispanics. They represent 66% of the adult general population, but they represent only 55% of transgender identified adults. And right next to it, we can see African American or Black non-Hispanics represent 12% of the adult general population, but 16% of transgender identified adults. So if we take our number of 2 million from earlier and take 16% of that, we get a total of about 320,000 Black trans people. But now we have to figure out what portion of that are trans men versus trans women. And for that, we can look at multiple studies. Here we can see multiple studies conducted over various different periods of time in different countries, and we can see that there's a general consensus of around 3.1 to 1 being male to female versus female to male. And this is generally accepted among transgender researchers. So assuming a 3-to-1 ratio, we can assume that 75% of transgenders are male to female transgenders versus female to male. So if we take 75% of the 320,000, we get 240,000. Now remember this stat from earlier that said 72% of trans homicide victims were Black trans women and femmes from 2010 to 2016? Well, let's take the 2016 number and take 72% of that and assume that that is the rate of death for Black trans women. So if we take 23 times 0.72, we get 16.56. So let's just round that up to be generous and say it's 17. So now we can do 17 divided by 240,000, then multiply that by 100,000, and we get a per capita rate of 7 per 100,000. Now that rate is much higher per capita than it is for the overall transgender community. So we have a rate of 7 per 100,000 versus the 1.15 per 100,000. So almost 7 times higher for Black trans women than the overall trans community. And we can see it's even higher than the general population of the United States, which is about 5.3 per 100,000. But I think there's a better comparison to make here. Black trans women were obviously assigned male at birth. Their sex is male, while their gender that they identify with is female. So let's compare those numbers to that of Black males. Now, the Violence Policy Center did a study called Black Homicide Victimization in the United States, an analysis of 2016 homicide data. So it's the same year as we're referencing for the trans stuff. And if we scroll down, we can see the homicide rate for Black male victims was 37.12 per 100,000. Now, I don't need to tell you that 37 per 100,000 as a homicide rate for Black males is over 5 times higher than the rate of 7 per 100,000 for Black trans women. So this seems like it's less of an issue specifically for trans people or trans women or even Black trans women, but it's more of an issue when it comes to Black trans women of them being Black rather than them being trans. But there's another stat from that Mike article that really got my attention. So let's take a look at that. So when we go to the beginning and scroll down, we can see they start giving stats that for the general population of the United States, 1 in 19,000 people is murdered every year. So here they're doing the 1 in whatever thousand instead of doing a certain rate per 100,000, which is the standard. So it's kind of a little bit confusing, but we'll get to that in a bit. And if we scroll down further, we see for young adults, the chance is 1 in 12,000. But when we go for young Black trans women, the chance is 1 in 2,600. And if you read the fine print at the bottom here, you can see approximate average annual rate for ages 15 to 34, according to Mike data and an average of transgender population estimates. So why the specific ages of 15 to 34 and the focus on young Black trans women? I'm not sure, but I'm guessing it's to make the numbers even more shocking. But notice how they didn't include a similar number for young Black males. Well, we'll get to that, but first let's deal with this weird conversion we have to do. Instead of doing the per 100,000, we're doing the 1 in 2,600. So let's start from the beginning. 1 in 19,000. So the way we can figure out the per capita, per 100,000 number from this is we take 100,000 and divide by 19,000. And you can see that gets us a rate of 5.2 or 5.3 per 100,000. So that's an accurate number. And if we go down for young adults, we can see the same thing. We take 100,000, divide by 12,000, and we get a rate of 8.33 per 100,000. Now notice that this rate is already higher than the total rate for Black trans women. But now we're going to go down and focus on the young Black trans women, and we see it's a rate of 1 in 2,600. So let's convert that to per 100,000. So we take 100,000, divide by 2,600, and we get this huge number of 38.46 per 100,000. So we'll just call it 38.5. And we can see that this rate is actually right about the same and slightly higher than the rate for Black males. But remember, they're focusing down on this young portion, Black portion, and trans women portion. So they're taking all these different factors and putting them into one to get the most ridiculous number that you can possibly find. So if they're going to compare young Black trans women and say that the rate is super high, well, let's not just look at Black men. Let's look at the stats for young Black men when it comes to homicide. Now, I got to say, it was kind of hard to find this data, and this is old data, unfortunately, but we can see this is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics Crime Data Brief. And if we scroll down, we can see the numbers for Black males between the ages of 12 and 24. And the number is actually kind of close to the number for overall trans people at about 2 million, but this one is 3.2 million. But remember, these numbers are going to be per capita. So black males between the ages of 12 and 24, the homicide rate per 100,000 for this group was 114.9. That's insane. So 114.9 for the age range of 12 to 24, that is much higher than the rate even for young black trans women by a factor of 3. Now, to be fair, this was 1992 and homicide rates have fallen significantly since then. So even if you want to assume a 40 to 50% reduction, which is what we saw since the early 90s until now, well, the rate is still higher for young black males between the ages of 12 and 24 than it is for young black trans women. But let's look at more data on this. Here is another report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics published in 2011, and it looks at homicide trends in the United States from 1980 to 2008. And if we scroll down, we can see a graph that shows the black male homicide victimization rates between 1980 and 2008 by age. Now, of course, we can't compare 100% like to like, being that 15 to 34 age range that we had for the young black trans women statistic, but this is the best we can do. And we can still see, even to this day, up until 2008, that the homicide rate for young black males between the ages of 18 and 24 is still significantly higher than it is for young black trans women. We can see in the text on the side here, in 2008, black males age 18 to 24 years old had the highest homicide victimization rate, 91.1 homicides per 100,000. That's more than double the rate of young black trans women. So this issue of homicide seems to be more an issue of being young and black rather than being trans. In fact, being trans seems to be a more of a protective property when it comes to homicide. Now, I wanted to make this video because I see people bringing up this issue time and time again, yet I almost never see the stats behind it. And if the stats are ever presented, they're never presented in context or in comparison to other like groups. So I hope you guys learned something from this video, and if you did, give this video a thumbs up. And if you've heard other people make these types of arguments about trans homicides being extremely high compared to the general population, be sure to send them this video and share your thoughts with them and what you've learned. And that's the end of the video, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. And I'll see you next time, bro.